Hello everyone, I'm your instructor Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at UBC campus. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about the idea that public health can actually promote freedom and not just restrict freedom. And this is an idea that is defended in the Griffiths and West paper, the second reading from week 4. So the starting point for this paper by Griffiths and West is something called the Nuffield Intervention Ladder. And this is a graphic that originates from a 2007 report titled Public Health Ethical Issues, put out by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is a kind of group that publishes public health and bioethics advice and guidelines in the United Kingdom. And so the graphic is intended to represent the relationship between freedom and public health interventions. And so if you look here, the idea is, you see these numbers. The numbers are supposed to indicate the extent to which freedom is being limited or restricted. And so if you have down here, do nothing or simply monitor the situation, that's 0 restriction on freedom. If you provide information, that's starting to restrict freedom just a little bit. If you enable choice, for example, by providing access to smoking cessation or building bicycle lanes, that's supposed to restrict freedom even a little bit more, and so on up the ladder until you get to eliminate choice, where this is like, restricting freedom all the way to level 7. So in general, the idea is the more public health intervention you have, the less freedom you get. And that's a sort of fundamental assumption that sort of runs through this whole report, and one that's kind of common in many discussions of public health ethics. So it's that assumption that Griffiths and West want to challenge. And so Griffiths and West argue that, in fact, this unspoken assumption of the Nuffield Intervention Ladder, that public health interventions always restrict freedom, is in fact false. They want to argue that, first of all, there are many different conceptions of freedom that have been discussed in literature on ethics and philosophy. And they argue that for any of these conceptions of freedom that you choose, there's going to be some public health interventions that don't decrease freedom in that sense, and possibly even increase that type of freedom. So they focus on 4 types of freedom, and those are negative freedom, the Republican conception of freedom, positive freedom, and autonomy. So we'll go through those one by one, and for each one we'll talk about how it's possible for a public health intervention not to restrict that type of freedom, and maybe in some cases actually enhance that type of freedom. Let's start with negative freedom. Negative freedom in some ways is the most basic type of freedom. It essentially means being left alone. It's this absence of external restrictions or coercion that would prevent you from doing what you want. So being locked up in a jail cell would be something that obviously restricts freedom in this sense. Being coerced, if someone points a gun at you and says your money or your life, that's also restricting your freedom. So coercion, external restrictions, these are things that limit negative freedom. According to Griffiths and West, however, there are public health measures that do not restrict or infringe on negative freedom at all. An important example of this is public health information. So for instance, about healthy diet. This is just an image from the Canada Food Guide. And so providing information, let's say, about healthy diet does not stop you from eating what you want to eat. You could look at the Canadian Food Guide and still go and eat chips and I don't know, Cheese Whiz or whatever unhealthy food you like. This doesn't stop you from doing that. However, it does provide you with information, and that might actually help you achieve the goals that you want. It might help you be able to behave in ways and act in ways that are more in keeping with what you want to achieve in your life by having this information. And so it doesn't restrict you, it doesn't coerce you, so it's not restricting negative freedom, and it might even help you achieve what you want in your life. Similarly, they argue that libertarian paternalism or nudging, which involves situations where healthier options are just made more easily accessible, but no options are eliminated, can encourage healthy behavior, but does not restrict negative freedom. So an example of this might be putting the water bottles at the front and having, say, the pop bottles behind at a cafeteria, so you have to reach over the water bottles to grab the sugar sweetened beverages, and maybe more people will just grab the thing that's more convenient. In this case, it's not restricting anyone's freedom in the sense of negative freedom, but it is encouraging people to choose things that are more healthy for them. Okay, so that's negative freedom. What about the Republican conception of freedom? Now, this is a concept of freedom that's a little less sort of straightforward than negative freedom. Republican conception of freedom is freedom from domination. It means you're not sort of controlled or manipulated by somebody else. And this is different from not being interfered with, because sometimes interference is necessary to prevent someone from being manipulated by someone else. The example that Griffiths and West give of this, where being interfered with is necessary to prevent someone from dominating you, is the example of Ulysses tied to the mast. And if you ever read the Iliad, or the Odyssey, if you're interested in Homer and ancient Greek literature, this is a story where Ulysses is sailing back to Greece with his crew, and they're passing a stretch of ocean where there are these sirens. The sirens are like these sort of mermaids that sing these amazingly beautiful songs, and anyone who hears these songs is so taken by them that they just want to be with the sirens, and they jump overboard and then they drown. So Ulysses wants to hear the sirens, but he doesn't want to drown. So what he does is he has all of his men and his crew put wax in their ears so that the other men on the ship can't hear the sirens, and he makes them tie him to the mast, and he makes them agree that no matter how much he begs, they will not untie him. So they sail past the sirens. He gets to hear the sirens, and of course, once he hears the sirens, he says, "Oh, untie me, let me go. I want to dive in the ocean with the sirens." But his men ignore his pleas, so he gets to hear the sirens, and he lives to tell about it. So the idea here is that by restricting his negative freedom, by literally tying him down in this case, Ulysses is protected from being dominated, in this case, by the sirens. Now, if you think of a public health parallel to this example, it could be something like restrictions on things like advertising or junk food or cigarettes or alcohol. These can prevent people from being dominated by corporations that sell these products. And we'll also consider this idea in class in connection with bans on cell phones in public schools. Positive freedoms. This is the third type of freedom that's discussed in the Griffiths and West article. So positive freedom is a sort of ability to do things that you want. And this requires more than just being left alone. It also requires more than not being dominated by someone else. It requires the positive presence of substantive opportunities to gain education, to access healthcare, to gain things in life that you need to be able to do stuff. And this is often going to require interventions by the government to provide things like public education, maybe to provide access to healthcare, to provide access to affordable housing, and so on. And so an example that would illustrate this idea is access to urban green spaces. Access to urban green spaces clearly can enhance positive freedom. It enhances your ability to exercise outside, to breathe clean air, and so on. And so this would be an example where there's an intervention, but rather than limiting your freedom, it's actually increasing your freedom. Interestingly, sometimes public health interventions that promote positive freedom can do so by limiting negative freedom. Examples of this sort include things like laws requiring seat belts, taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, taxes on cigarettes or alcohol would be further examples. And these promote positive freedom in the sense that health is essential for positive freedom, right? If you're sick, if you're getting a car crash and you are paralyzed from the waist down, this is going to seriously limit your positive freedom. So laws that require things like seat belts or impose taxes on unhealthy foods actually can promote positive freedom by limiting negative freedom. Okay. So finally, the last type of freedom on the list, autonomy. And in some ways, this is the most complex of all four. So a key idea of autonomy is it's going to involve elements of a number of the other types of freedom that we've talked about. So in a short statement, autonomy means being able to rationally act according to your own preferences. And to see the difference with positive freedom, someone who has positive freedom might be able to do what they want, but the things that they want might not, might be things that they've just been manipulated to want by, like, advertising, for example. But autonomy means that the preferences that you're acting on are in some sense authentically your own. You're not just being manipulated. So it's connected to the idea of Republican freedom. But to be autonomous, you do need a good range of opportunities to choose from. You need information about the pros and cons of those different options. And you need to be able to form your own preferences without manipulation, and you need the ability to rationally deliberate. And public health interventions can promote all these dimensions of autonomy. And we've given some examples of that already. So if you think of the opportunities like the green spaces, education, obviously interventions can promote those things, and they can provide information. There can be restrictions on advertising, for example, advertising junk food to young people and things like that can help protect preferences of young people from manipulation, and providing information and education, of course, can also help people rationally deliberate. And one of the key ideas is what counts as someone's authentic preferences. And this is something that Griffiths and West discuss under the heading of reflective endorsement. So for autonomy, the key idea that your preferences that you're acting on are your own preferences. You're not being manipulated by someone else. And the idea is similar to the Republican conception of freedom. And so reflective endorsement means that the preferences that you're acting on are ones that you would endorse if you sort of sat down quietly and sort of gave it some time and thought about it. They're not impulses or bad habits. So, for example, it's a well-known fact that most people who smoke wish they could quit. So someone, let's imagine, who's trying to quit smoking, by limiting their exposure to cigarettes. So, for example, by having, as now common in many countries, including Canada, having cigarettes sort of out of sight when you go into a store. Like you go into the grocery store, the cigarettes are sort of behind a counter, they're locked in a box, you can't see them. You don't see a bunch of bright, colorful, appealing boxes with ads on them and things. So they're sort of out of sight and out of mind. The idea is that kind of restriction is actually helping someone stick to their plan of, in this case, thinking, okay, I know smoking is bad for me. I know it costs a lot of money. I know it's bad for the health of the people around me. If you have kids, it's bad for your kids. And you might think, geez, this is really something I should cut back on, but it's difficult for you to do it. Okay? So this is a key idea, that there can be a difference between someone's preferences that they reflectively endorse, that when they think about it, what's important in my life, what are my values, what do I really want out of life, here are the things I should want. I should want to give up smoking. But those kinds of reflectively endorsed preferences are not always the preferences that people act on. Whether people act on their sort of reflectively endorsed preferences or not, or whether they act on impulse or bad habits, is often affected by their surroundings, by the sort of environment in which they are in. And therefore, interventions that change that environment, for example, by putting the cigarettes out of sight in the grocery store, can actually help people behave in ways that are more in keeping with the preferences that they endorse themselves and want to be able to follow. Okay. So where does all of this lead us? To a new ladder. And in this revised ladder, public health interventions can increase freedom, for example, by providing information, by educating for autonomy, for ensuring adequate choice, or they can restrict freedom, for example, through disincentives like taxes, or just eliminating certain choices down here. And so here the idea is that public health can have a restricting or expanding effect on freedom, and that it isn't always restricting freedom. And so this is a very important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about how liberalism and public health connect to one another. All right, so we'll stop there, and I will see you in, actually I have to say I won't see you in class because I'll be away this week, but you will see Amanda in class. All right, bye-bye.